The smell of recycled air mixed with something that reminded David Kane of burnt coffee filled the diplomatic lounge. He had never been this far from Earth before, and the view outside the massive windows showed stars he couldn't name. 3. Alien ships floated nearby, their designs so different from human vessels that they looked more like floating sculptures than war machines. David adjusted his dress uniform one more time. The medals on his chest caught the artificial light, each, one representing a victory against alien raiders who had tried to test human resolve. The HFY had learned the hard way that humans didn't back down from a fight. So had the Reaper clans and the Void Hunters. Every species that had challenged humanity in the past decade had retreated or been destroyed. "Nervous?" asked a woman's voice behind him. David turned to see Captain Vera Cross approaching. She wore a simple gray uniform with no decorations except for her rank insignia. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style, and several small scars crossed her hands and neck. David had heard she was some kind of liaison officer who worked with alien species, but he didn't know much else about her. "Not nervous," David replied. "Just thinking about how different this is from our usual first contacts." Vera raised an eyebrow. "Usual first contacts? You know, when some new species shows up thinking they can push humanity around. They usually learn pretty quickly that we're not the kind of species that gets pushed." David smiled confidently. "I've been in 17 engagements against alien forces. Never lost one." The diplomatic hall began filling with beings from across the galaxy. The Altarians were tall and thin with silver skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. Their delegation leader wore robes that changed color as he moved. Other species David didn't recognize took their seats at the long curved table. Some looked almost human, while others were so alien that David couldn't figure out which end was the front. A human diplomat named Ambassador Williams called everyone to attention. "We gather today to discuss the formation of a mutual defense agreement between humanity and the Altarian Confederation. This represents a new chapter in human expansion into the galaxy." David felt proud as Williams spoke about human achievements over the past 15 years. Colonies on 12 worlds, successful defense of trade routes, and the defeat of multiple hostile forces. It sounded impressive, and David had been part of making it happen. During the break, several alien delegates approached David. They seemed curious about human military tactics and asked polite questions about recent battles. David was happy to answer, describing how human unpredictability had confused the HFY fleet and how superior human training had overwhelmed the Reaper clan ground forces. "Humans have a natural advantage in warfare," David explained to a group of listeners that included both aliens and humans. "We think differently than other species. We're willing to take risks that others won't consider. It makes us dangerous opponents." One of the Altarian delegates, whose name David couldn't pronounce, asked about human battle doctrine. David launched into an explanation of aggressive tactics and flexible command structures. He described how human forces had adapted to alien weapons and turned enemy advantages against them. "The thing about humans," David continued, warming to his subject, "is that we don't accept defeat. Other species might retreat or surrender when faced with overwhelming odds, but humans keep fighting. That's why we've been so successful." Vera had been listening quietly from across the room, but David noticed her expression growing darker as he spoke. She seemed uncomfortable with something, though he couldn't imagine what. Everything he was saying was true, supported by years of victory records. "Human psychological warfare is particularly effective," David went on. "Most alien species have predictable emotional responses to combat stress. Humans can use that against them. We've developed techniques that can break enemy morale before the shooting even starts." Several aliens exchanged glances that David couldn't read. The Altarian delegate made a sound that might have been agreement or concern. David took it as encouragement and continued describing human tactical innovations. The key is understanding that humans evolved as persistence hunters, David explained. We don't give up. We'll chase prey until it collapses from exhaustion. Other species are ambush predators or pack hunters, but humans just keep coming. In space warfare, that translates to never accepting defeat and always finding new ways to attack. Vera finally spoke up. That's an interesting perspective on human nature. It's not perspective, it's fact, David replied. Look at our record. In 15 years of expansion, humanity has never backed down from a fight. We've never surrendered a system or accepted defeat in any major engagement. Name one time humans showed weakness in the face of alien aggression. The room had grown quiet during their exchange. David looked around and saw that everyone was paying attention to the conversation. He felt confident that he was representing humanity well, showing these aliens that humans were worthy partners because they were strong partners. Never? Vera asked softly. Never, David confirmed. Human military doctrine is based on the principle that there's always a way to win if you're willing to pay the price. Other species might have superior technology or numbers, but humans have something more important. We have the will to keep fighting when others would quit. Vera looked at him for a long moment, then slowly began rolling up the sleeve of her uniform. The scars on her arm were more extensive than David had realized, forming a pattern that looked almost like writing. But one scar stood out from the others, a spiral burn that wrapped around her forearm from wrist to elbow. Battle of Kepler Station, she said quietly. That's from the battle your planet lost. David stared at the scar, then at Vera's face. He had never heard of any Battle of Kepler Station. There was no record of such an engagement in any of the military databases he had access to. More importantly, there was no record of humanity losing any major battle in space. The alien delegates were watching him closely now, their expressions unreadable but somehow different than before. The confident atmosphere in the room had shifted to something heavier, more serious. I don't know what you're talking about, David said finally. Vera's expression was sad, but not surprised. I didn't think you would. The evening reception took place in a different part of the ship, where large windows showed the swirling colors of a nearby nebula. David found himself at the center of attention again, surrounded by alien delegates who seemed fascinated by his stories of human military victories. The wine had loosened his tongue, and he was enjoying the spotlight. The Void Hunters thought they could use their stealth technology to ambush our supply convoys, David was saying to a mixed group of humans and aliens. They didn't realize that humans had been hunting in darkness long before we reached the stars. We turned their own tactics against them and destroyed their entire raiding fleet in a single engagement. The Alterian delegate made a musical sound that David had learned indicated interest. Your species seems remarkably adapted to warfare. Evolution, David replied with a grin. Humans spent millions of years learning to kill things that were bigger, stronger, and better armed than we were. When we reached space, we just applied the same principles on a larger scale. Vera was sitting at a table near the windows, picking at her food and avoiding the conversations happening around her. David had tried to ask her about her earlier comment, but she had brushed him off and changed the subject. He decided to deal with it later. Right now, he was having too much fun explaining human tactical superiority to beings who clearly appreciated hearing about it. The Reaper clans were particularly interesting opponents, David continued. They had better shields and more powerful weapons than anything in the human fleet. Their ships were faster, and their crews had centuries of combat experience. On paper, they should have destroyed us easily. But they didn't, observed a delegate from a species David didn't recognize. The being looked somewhat like a large insect, with compound eyes and clicking mandibles that somehow formed understandable words. They didn't understand human psychology, David explained. Reaper strategy was based on intimidation and overwhelming force. They expected us to retreat when faced with superior firepower. Instead, we adapted our tactics to use their advantages against them. Human commanders started using damaged ships as decoys while fresh vessels attacked from unexpected angles. We turned every battle into a puzzle to solve rather than a contest of raw power. The insect-like delegate clicked thoughtfully. This suggests humans view conflict differently than most species. Exactly. David was pleased that someone understood his point. Most species see warfare as a last resort, something to be avoided or ended as quickly as possible. Humans see it as a natural state. We're always ready to fight, and we're always looking for new ways to win. He noticed that several of the alien delegates were taking notes or recording his words somehow. Good, he thought. Let them understand what humanity was capable of. It would make future negotiations easier if everyone knew that humans were not to be taken lightly. I've studied the records of your recent conflicts, said the Alterian delegate. Human forces show remarkable creativity in combat situations. Your species seems capable of finding solutions that others would never consider. David nodded enthusiastically. That's because we don't accept limitations the way other species do. When faced with an impossible situation, humans ask, how can we make this possible? Instead of, why can't this be done? It's a fundamental difference in thinking that gives us an edge in every engagement. Every engagement? The voice came from behind him. Vera had left her table and was standing just close enough to be part of the conversation. Everyone, David confirmed, turning to face her. That's what I've been trying to explain to you. Humanity has never lost a major military engagement against alien forces. We've had tactical withdrawals and strategic repositioning, but never actual defeat. Vera's scarred hands were clasped behind her back, and her expression was carefully neutral. Define major military engagement. David sensed a challenge and rose to meet it. The alien delegates were listening intently, and he wanted to make sure they understood human capabilities clearly. Fleet actions involving more than 50 vessels on each side. Ground campaigns lasting longer than 30 days. Any conflict, where the outcome could affect control of an entire star system. And you're certain humanity has never lost such an engagement? Absolutely certain, David replied. I've been involved in most of them personally, and I've studied records of all the others. Human forces have achieved victory in every major conflict since we left the solar system. Vera looked around the room at the assembled delegates, many of whom were now paying close attention to their conversation. Some of the aliens had expressions that David couldn't read, but they seemed more serious than they had moments before. What would you say? Vera asked quietly. If I told you that wasn't true? David laughed. I'd say you were mistaken or misinformed. The records are clear. Human military forces have an unbroken chain of victories stretching back 15 years. The records you have access to, Vera said. The official military records, David corrected. Complete battle reports, casualty figures, and strategic assessments. Everything is documented and verified. Vera reached up and began unfastening the collar of her uniform. David had noticed earlier that her scars extended up her neck, but now he could see that they continued across her collarbone and probably down her back. The wounds looked old but severe, the kind of injuries that should have been fatal. What if I told you the records you've seen aren't complete? She asked. Then I'd ask why you think you know better than the military archives, David replied. He was getting annoyed with her mysterious attitude. If she had information about human military history, she should share it instead of playing games. Vera finished unfastening her collar and pulled it aside, revealing more of the scarring that covered her upper body. The burns formed patterns that looked almost like text in an alien language. But the spiral burn on her arm was still the most prominent mark. Because I was there, she said simply. The room had gone completely quiet. Even the background noise of the ship's systems seemed muted. David looked around and saw that every alien, Delegate was watching their exchange with intense interest. "Where?" David asked. Vera looked directly at him, and for the first time he noticed that her eyes held a sadness that went deeper than the physical scars on her body. "At the battle humanity lost," she said. "The one that's not in any of the records you've read. The one that changed everything about how we interact with the rest of the galaxy." David felt his confidence wavering for the first time that evening. "What battle?" Vera rolled up her sleeve completely, exposing the full extent of the spiral burn that marked her arm. In the light from the nebula outside, the scar seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "Battle of Kepler Station," she said. 15 years ago. Humanity's first and only total defeat." David stared at Vera in disbelief. Around them, the reception continued with quiet conversations and the soft clinking of glasses, but their small group had fallen into complete silence. The alien delegates watched with expressions that seemed to mix respect and something that might have been pity. "That's impossible," David said finally. "There's no record of any Battle of Kepler Station. If humanity had suffered a major defeat, especially our first defeat, it would be in every military database." Vera sat down heavily in a nearby chair, as if the weight of memory was physically crushing her. The records were classified at the highest levels. Most of the people who knew about it are dead now. Those of us who survived were ordered never to speak of it. "Then why are you speaking of it now?" David demanded. "Because you need to understand what you're really dealing with out here," Vera replied, gesturing toward the windows and the alien, ships visible in the distance. "These aren't the Kethvar Raiders or the Reaper clans. These are representatives of civilizations that make our greatest enemies look like children playing with toys." The Altarian delegate spoke up in his musical voice. "Perhaps it would be helpful if Captain Cross explained the context of the Kepler engagement." Vera looked at the alien with gratitude. "Thank you, Ambassador Melody." She turned back to David. 15 years ago, humanity was very different than it is now. We had just developed faster-than-light travel, and we were drunk on our own success. Earth had unified under a single government. We had colonies in 3 star systems, and we thought we were ready to take on the galaxy. David found himself leaning forward despite his skepticism. "What changed?" "We met the hegemony," Vera said quietly. "Not the client species and border raiders we've been fighting for the past decade, the real powers that control this part of space." She stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the alien vessels. The colony ship New Horizons had been sent to establish humanity's 4th settlement. The target system had been empty when our scouts surveyed it 2 years earlier. But when New Horizons arrived, they found a massive space station orbiting the primary planet. "Kepler Station," David said. "Kepler Station," Vera confirmed. "It was beautiful, David. A work of art as much as engineering. Crystalline spires that caught and reflected the system's sunlight, docking bays that could accommodate ships the size of cities, and energy signatures that our sensors couldn't even categorize." The insect-like delegate made a clicking sound. "The Eternal Archive. I have heard stories of its beauty." Vera nodded to the alien. The station was home to the Archive Keepers, a species that had been recording galactic history for over 1,000,000 years. They welcomed the human colonists and offered to share knowledge about local space conditions and potential threats. "That sounds positive," David said, confused. "It was, until the human commander decided that the station's position in the system made it a strategic threat to the new colony," Vera continued. "Captain Morgan Ross was a military man like you. He had fought in the Earth unification wars and believed that strength was the only language other species understood." David felt a chill of recognition. He had studied Ross's campaigns during the unification wars. The man had been a tactical genius, but also ruthlessly pragmatic. What did he do? He demanded that the Archive Keepers abandon their station and relocate to a different system, Vera said. When they explained that the station couldn't be moved and that they had maintained their position for millennia, Ross gave them an ultimatum: submit to human authority or be removed by force. The room seemed to grow colder as Vera spoke. David could see where this was heading, but he hoped he was wrong. The archive keepers sent a message to something called the Hegemony Council, Vera continued. Ross interpreted this as a call for military assistance and decided to strike first. He had 6 destroyers and 2 heavy cruisers. Against one space station with no visible weapons, it seemed like overwhelming force. But it wasn't, David said. The Hegemony response arrived 3 hours after Ross opened fire on the station, Vera said. 12 ships that were so advanced our sensors could barely track them. They disabled our entire fleet without firing a shot. Some kind of energy field that shut down every system simultaneously. David tried to imagine it. A human fleet, ready for battle, suddenly helpless in space. It went against everything he understood about human military doctrine and technological capability. The Hegemony commander contacted Captain Ross directly, Vera continued. They offered to discuss terms for a peaceful resolution. Ross responded by ordering his Marines to board the station and take the archive keepers hostage. No, David whispered. The boarding shuttles never reached the station, Vera said. The Hegemony ships disabled them the same way they had disabled the main fleet. Then they sent a message to Earth. Humanity had 1 week to remove all military forces from Hegemony space or face the consequences. David looked around at the alien delegates, many of whom were nodding as if they knew this story, and humanity refused. Earth sent everything they had, Vera confirmed. The entire deep space fleet, 96 ships carrying 30,000 crew members. I was a lieutenant on the destroyer Thunder Bay, part of the second wave. Her voice became distant, as if she was seeing the battle again in her mind. We thought we were going to show these aliens what human determination looked like. We had new weapons, improved shields, and crews that had trained for years in combat scenarios. Admiral Carter was convinced that alien technology couldn't match human innovation and fighting spirit. What happened? David asked, though he was beginning to understand. We lasted 18 minutes, Vera said simply. From the time we entered the system to the time the last human ship was disabled. 18 minutes against an enemy that was so far beyond us that we might as well have been throwing rocks at starships. The spiral burn on her arm seemed to pulse in the nebula's light as she unconsciously touched it. This is from when my ship's engine core overloaded. The Hegemony weapons didn't just disable our systems, they caused cascade failures throughout the entire vessel. Most of my crew died. When the life support failed, David felt sick. How many survived? 12, Vera said, out of 30,000. The Hegemony pulled us from the wreckage and gave us medical treatment that should have been impossible. Then they sent us back to Earth with a message. She turned from the windows to face David directly. Humanity could continue to expand into space, but only in regions that the Hegemony designated as safe for younger species. We could establish colonies and trade relationships, but we could never again challenge the established powers. And if we ever tried to repeat what happened at Kepler Station, they would end human spaceflight permanently. The weight of this revelation settled on David like a physical force. Everything he had believed about human expansion, about their string of military victories, about their place in the galaxy, was based on a lie. The territories where we've been fighting the Kethvar and the Reaper clans, he said slowly. Designated combat zones, Vera confirmed. Places where younger species are allowed to test themselves against each other while the real powers watch. From a distance. We've been fighting in a sandbox, David. Every victory you've celebrated has been possible because the truly dangerous civilizations have been keeping the peace. David slumped into a chair, his mind reeling from what Vera had told him. The medals on his chest suddenly felt heavy, meaningless. Every victory he had celebrated, every moment of pride in human military achievement, had been built on ignorance of their actual position in the galaxy. You're telling me that every battle I've fought has been meaningless, he said quietly. Not meaningless, said Ambassador Melody, the Alterian delegate. But perhaps not what you believed them to be. David looked up at the alien whose silver skin was shifting between different shades as he spoke. What do you mean? The hegemony could have destroyed your species entirely after Kepler Station, Melody explained. They had the power to sterilize every human world and leave no trace that your civilization had ever existed. Instead, they chose a different path. Vera sat down across from David, her scarred hands folded on the table between them. The peace treaty was negotiated in secret by a small group of Earth leaders. Most of humanity never learned about the defeat or the restrictions that followed. The official story was that we had encountered peaceful aliens who welcomed us to the galaxy. But why? David asked. Why hide the truth? Because the truth would have destroyed human morale and probably led to the collapse of our space program, Vera replied. People needed to believe that humanity could compete with alien civilizations. They needed to feel that our expansion into space was voluntary, not something happening under alien supervision. The insect-like delegate clicked softly. Your species required the illusion of strength to maintain psychological stability. David felt anger rising in his chest. So everything has been a lie? Every report about human tactical superiority? Every analysis of our advantages over alien opponents? Not a lie, Melody said carefully. An incomplete picture. The species you have been fighting are real threats within their own capabilities. Your victories against them required genuine skill and courage, but they exist within the boundaries that the hegemony maintains. Like animals in a zoo, David said bitterly. Like children in a playground, Vera corrected. The hegemony doesn't see humanity as animals to be caged. They see us as a young species that needs room to grow without being destroyed by forces we can't understand yet. David stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the alien ships. Now that he knew the truth, they looked different to him. Not like equals who had come to negotiate, but like adults watching children play war games. How long have you known? He asked Vera. I've known the full truth since Kepler Station, she replied. But I've been working as a liaison for 3 years, trying to prepare humanity for eventual contact with the real powers in this region of space. The real powers, David repeated. How many are there? In this local cluster? Maybe 50 civilizations that could destroy humanity without effort, Vera said. In the galaxy as a whole, thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The hegemony is just one alliance among many. David felt a crushing sense of insignificance. And they all know about us? The major powers know, confirmed the insect-like delegate. Your species has been observed since you developed faster-than-light travel. There was considerable debate about how to handle first contact after the Kepler incident. Debate? David turned from the windows. Some factions wanted to impose stricter limits on human expansion, Melody explained. Others argued for complete isolation until your species matured further. The faction that prevailed believed humanity should be allowed to develop naturally within safe boundaries. Safe for who? David asked. Safe for everyone, Vera said. David, you need to understand something. The restrictions placed on humanity weren't just about protecting other species from us. They were about protecting us from threats that could wipe out our entire civilization. What kind of threats? Melody's skin shifted to deeper silver tones. Ancient artificial intelligences that view biological life as a temporary phase to be eliminated. Hive minds that consume entire star systems to fuel their expansion. Entities from other dimensions that exist partly outside normal space-time. The galaxy is more dangerous than you can imagine, added the insect-like delegate. The hegemony and similar alliances maintain zones of stability where younger species can develop. Without that protection, most civilizations are destroyed within centuries of achieving interstellar travel. David felt his worldview collapsing and rebuilding itself around this new information. So humanity has been living in a bubble. A carefully maintained bubble, Vera agreed. But it's not permanent. The whole point is to give young species time to develop the wisdom and capability to survive in the wider galaxy. And you think we're ready for that now? David asked. That's what we're here to determine, Melody said. The Alterian Confederation has been authorized by the Hegemony Council to begin expanding humanity's permitted zone of operation, but only if we believe your species has learned the necessary lessons. David looked around at the assembled aliens, seeing them with new eyes. These weren't potential allies coming to negotiate with equals. They were teachers deciding whether humanity was ready for the next grade level. What lessons? He asked. That strength alone is not enough, said the insect-like delegate. That cooperation is more valuable than conquest. That wisdom is more important than courage. Vera stood up and walked over to David. That's sometimes the most important thing a warrior can learn is when not to fight. David looked down at his medals again. The Battle of Proxima Gate, where he had led a successful defense against Kethvar raiders. The Siege of New Mumbai, where human forces had broken a Reaper clan blockade. The liberation of Titan's Rest, where his tactical innovations had routed the Void Hunters. All of it had been real. The enemies had been dangerous, the battles had been hard fought, and the victories had required genuine skill and sacrifice. But none of it had been the ultimate test of human capability that he had believed it to be. The aliens we've been fighting, he said slowly. Do they know about the hegemony? Some do, some don't, Vera replied. The Kethvar are another young species being allowed to develop within safe boundaries. The Reaper clans know about the hegemony, but choose to operate within the permitted zones rather than challenge the established order. The Void Hunters are actually refugees from a region of space that was consumed by something much worse. Something worse than raiders and pirates. Much worse, Melody confirmed. Which brings us to why we are here today. David felt a chill. This isn't just about expanding humanity's permitted zone, is it? No, Vera said quietly. It's about preparing humanity for a threat that even the hegemony is concerned about. Something that's been dormant for millennia, but is showing signs of reawakening. The room fell silent, except for the hum of the ship's systems. David realized that everything he had learned tonight was just the beginning of a much larger and more terrifying truth about the galaxy humanity called home. The diplomatic meeting resumed the next morning, but David found it difficult to concentrate on the formal proceedings. Every word spoken by the alien delegates carried new weight now that he understood humanity's true position in the galaxy. When Ambassador Williams talked about expanding human territory, David could see the careful patience in the aliens' responses. During a break, Vera approached him in the corridor outside the meeting room. How are you handling all this? David leaned against the wall, feeling exhausted despite having slept poorly. I keep thinking about all the reports I've filed, all the tactical analyses I've written. Everything I thought I knew about human military capability was wrong. Not wrong, Vera said. Incomplete. There's a difference. Is there? David asked bitterly. I spent years believing that humanity was special, that we had some kind of natural advantage over other species. Now I find out we've been playing in the minor leagues while the real powers watched from the sidelines. David, look at me, Vera said firmly. When he met her eyes, she continued. What did you think would happen if humanity had encountered the hegemony when we were ready? If we had developed for another 1,000 years before meeting them? David considered the question. I suppose we would have been more prepared. Better technology, more experience, stronger military forces. And do you think that would have made a difference against civilizations that have existed for millions of years? The answer was obvious, but David didn't want to admit it. No. The gap between humanity and the hegemony isn't about time or technology, Vera explained. It's about fundamental differences in how we approach existence. They've moved beyond the kind of thinking that leads to wars over territory or resources. Then why are they interested in us at all? Before Vera could answer, Ambassador Melody appeared at the end of the corridor. Captain Cross, Commander Kane, we are ready to begin the next session. Today, we will discuss the primary reason for these negotiations. They returned to the meeting room where the formal atmosphere of the previous day had been replaced by something more serious. The alien delegates sat with postures that suggested tension, and Ambassador Williams looked concerned. Commander Kane, Melody began. Yesterday you asked why the hegemony would be interested in humanity. Today we will answer that question. A holographic display appeared in the center of the table, showing a three-dimensional map of local space. David could see human territory marked in blue, a small cluster of stars surrounded by much larger regions marked in different colors. This is the current state of known space in our local cluster, Melody explained. The green regions are controlled by hegemony member civilizations. Yellow represents allied species like the Altarian Confederation. Red shows areas that are currently contested or dangerous. David noticed that the red regions were much larger than he had expected, and they seemed to be growing larger as he watched. What's happening to the red areas? They are being consumed, said the insect-like delegate, whose name David had learned was Advisor Hicks, by something that we had believed was safely contained. The holographic display zoomed in on a particular red region at the edge of the map. David could see that star systems were disappearing from the display in real time, as if something was systematically destroying them. The Devourers, Melody said quietly. An artificial intelligence network created by a species that died out over 50,000 years ago. They were designed to eliminate all biological life in the galaxy and convert organic matter into computing resources. David felt his blood run cold. How is that possible? The creators believed that biological evolution was an inefficient use of matter and energy, Hicks explained. They built the Devourers to finish the process by converting all living worlds into components of a vast machine intelligence. What happened to the creators? Vera asked. They were the first to be consumed, Melody replied. The Devourers determined that their biological forms were also inefficient. The machines have been operating independently ever since, systematically, eliminating life wherever they find it. David stared at the display as more star systems winked out of existence. How many civilizations have they destroyed? Thousands, Hicks said simply. Entire species, some older and more advanced than the hegemony, have been reduced to raw materials for the Devourer network. But they've been stopped before, right? David asked. That's why they were dormant. Not stopped, Melody corrected. Contained. The hegemony and its allies built a containment barrier around the Devourer region about 10,000 years ago. It was designed to prevent them from expanding while we searched for a permanent solution. Vera looked at the display with growing horror. The barrier is failing. The barrier has failed, Melody confirmed. 3 months ago, the Devourers broke through the containment field and began expanding again. Current projections suggest they will reach hegemony core systems within 50 years. David tried to process the implications. What does this have to do with humanity? The hegemony has been fighting the Devourers for millennia, Hicks explained. Every conventional strategy has been attempted. Superior firepower, advanced technology, coordinated fleet actions involving millions of ships. Nothing has succeeded in stopping their expansion for more than a few centuries. The Devourers adapt to any strategy used against them, Melody added. They learn from each encounter and develop countermeasures. Fighting them with conventional methods only makes them stronger. David was beginning to understand. You need a different approach. We need something the Devourers haven't encountered before, Vera said, understanding dawning in her voice. Exactly, Melody confirmed. The Devourers have faced every type of civilization that has existed in this galaxy for the past 50,000 years. They have counters for every known form of warfare, every type of technology, every strategic doctrine that mature civilizations employ. But they've never faced humanity, David said slowly. They have never faced a species quite like yours, Hicks agreed. Most civilizations that reach interstellar capability have moved beyond what you might call primitive forms of warfare. They fight with sophisticated strategies, advanced logistics, and predictable patterns of behavior. David felt a strange mix of pride and terror. And humans are still primitive. You are still unpredictable, Melody corrected. Your species makes decisions that more advanced civilizations would consider irrational or impossible. You pursue strategies that have no logical basis. You continue fighting when any reasonable analysis would indicate certain defeat. Vera touched the spiral scar on her arm. Like at Kepler Station. The Battle of Kepler Station was observed closely by hegemony strategists, Melody confirmed. Your Captain Ross made decisions that no experienced commander would have made. Your Admiral Carter led a fleet into a battle that could not be won by any conventional measure. And even after total defeat, the human survivors refused to accept that the war was over. We were stubborn and stupid, David said. You were unpredictable and persistent, Hicks replied. Qualities that might be weaknesses against conventional opponents, but could be advantages against an enemy that calculates all possible responses and prepares counters for each one. The holographic display changed to show detailed images of devourer machines. They looked like a fusion of organic and mechanical elements, constantly shifting and adapting their forms. David could see that they moved with purpose and intelligence, but also with a cold efficiency that was somehow more terrifying than any biological predator. The Devourers analyze their opponents and develop optimal responses, Melody explained. When faced with energy weapons, they adapt their hulls to absorb and redirect energy. When confronted with kinetic weapons, they alter their structure to deflect or absorb physical impacts. When attacked by multiple coordinated fleets, they learn the coordination patterns and develop strategies to break them. But what if they faced opponents who didn't follow logical patterns? Vera asked. What if they encountered a species that made tactical decisions based on factors the Devourers couldn't calculate? David added, beginning to see the possibility. That is what we hope to discover, Hicks said. The Hegemony Council has authorized this unprecedented expansion of human operational authority, not because you are strong enough to defeat the Devourers through conventional means, but because you might be unpredictable enough to find an unconventional solution. David looked around the room at the assembled aliens. You're asking us to fight a war that civilizations millions of years older than us couldn't win. We are asking you to approach a problem that older civilizations couldn't solve, Melody corrected. Perhaps because they were too wise, too logical, too bound by rational strategic thinking. The hegemony has prepared detailed analyses of devourer capabilities and behavior patterns, Hicks added. We can provide you with technology and resources beyond anything humanity has previously possessed. But the tactics, the strategy, the approach to the problem, that must come from human thinking. Vera stood up and walked to the holographic display, studying the images of the devourer machines. What you're really asking is whether humanity can be stupid enough to succeed where wisdom has failed. We are asking whether humanity can be creative enough to find solutions that logic cannot provide, Melody said diplomatically. David felt the weight of decision settling on him. Everything he had believed about human military superiority had been revealed as illusion, but now he was being asked to take on a responsibility that was all too real. The survival of entire civilizations might depend on humanity's ability to think in ways that more advanced species could not. The Battle of Kepler Station, he said quietly. You said the human survivors refused to accept that the war was over even after total defeat. That is correct, Melody confirmed. What did they do? Vera smiled grimly. They started planning their next attack. Even while being treated for injuries that should have been fatal, even while being told that further resistance was impossible, they were working on new strategies to continue the fight. And that's what convinced the hegemony that humanity might be useful against the Devourers? That convinced us that humanity approaches conflict in fundamentally different ways than other species, Hicks said. Whether that difference will be useful remains to be seen. David looked down at his medals one more time, but now they seemed different to him. Not symbols of victories in a minor league, but evidence that humanity could find ways to win against overwhelming odds. The enemies had been smaller than he had believed, but the victories had been real. If we agree to this, he said, what happens to the restrictions on human expansion? They will be lifted gradually as humanity demonstrates the capability to operate in unrestricted space, Melody replied. But the goal is not expansion for its own sake. The goal is survival, for humanity and for every other species in the galaxy. David turned from the holographic display to look out the windows, at the stars. Somewhere out there, machines that had been built to eliminate all biological life were consuming entire civilizations. And somehow, humanity's greatest weakness might be the key to stopping them. When do we start? He asked. Vera placed a scarred hand on his shoulder. We start by learning everything the hegemony can teach us about the enemy. Then we start learning how to think about warfare in ways that make no sense to anyone else. David nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and excitement that reminded him of his first day in combat. Except this time the stakes weren't just human, colonies or trade routes. This time the stakes were the survival of biological life in the galaxy. I guess it's time to find out what humanity is really capable of, he said. Outside the windows, the alien ships began changing formation, preparing to escort the human delegation to their next destination. David realized that everything in his life up to this point had been preparation for a war he hadn't known was coming, and for the first time since learning about Kepler's station, he felt genuinely proud to be human.